Hawaii, our 50th state, is a state like no other. A remote island chain located almost in the center of the Pacific Ocean, it is one of the most isolated places on Earth, lying over 2,000 miles from the west coast of North America and nearly 4,000 miles from Japan. The Hawaiian Islands have a reputation as a tropical beach paradise, yet they also possess moist cloud forests and even alpine tundra high above the tree line, where snow regularly falls. This vast archipelago, nearly 1,500 miles long, is born of volcanic activity. As molten rock rises from a hot spot in the Earth's crust, islands are formed. Over millions of years, they are carried northwestward on the moving Pacific Plate, gradually eroding over time, leaving new islands to form over the hotspot. These islands were initially devoid of terrestrial plants or animals. Everything had to make a journey of thousands of miles to get here, floating, flying, drifting on the wind, or piggybacking on or even in another traveler. This gave rise to a unique assemblage of species.
There were no mammals in Hawaii pre-human contact, except for a small bat, which is still around. It's the endangered Hawaiian hoary bat.
No amphibians made it across the huge, salty expanse of the Pacific. Birds possess the greatest ability to fly the long distances needed to reach Hawaii, and it is birds that stand out as the most conspicuous and diverse animals on the islands. Gifted long-distance flyers, seabirds such as albatrosses, terns, shearwaters, and petrels were the first to colonize the islands. They were followed by geese, ducks, monarch flycatchers, rails, and many other species from North America, the South Pacific, and Asia. These birds found a paradise devoid of predatory mammals and with no biting insects to spread disease. In the absence of these pressures common on the continents, many new species evolved, including flightless geese, ducks, rails, and ibises.
In this isolated archipelago, millions of years of evolution resulted in a fantastic array of endemic bird species. Over 115 endemic bird species in all. This included a spectacular radiation of Hawaiian honeycreepers.
Each of the honeycreepers is extremely specialized in that its bill form is different than the others. And that bill is basically what gives it its job. The Evie is a nectar feeder, hence has that long curved bill to be able to get into the flowers. The Hawaii akepa, the bill is crossed and it feeds by opening up leaf buds and feeding in tiny insects in that leaf bud. So all of these birds evolved into their own specific niche over time, over the last 4 million years.
The bird that you're hearing most common in the background is the Hawaiian amakihi, which is another of the native honey creepers. But it is more of a generalist. It takes nectar and insects, so it has a lot of ability to adjust its diet, unlike Palilo, which is a seed specialist, eating only the pods of the mamane.
The Akea pola'au has a bill and behavior so unusual it is often called the Swiss Army knife bird. It uses the straight lower part of its bill like a woodpecker to open holes in trees, and then its long downward curving upper part to scoop them out. This example of the phenomenon of adaptive radiation was so beautifully on display in Hawaii that many have speculated that if Charles Darwin had visited here rather than the Galapagos, he would have developed his groundbreaking theories of evolution and natural selection much sooner. The image of Hawaii as an island paradise of beaches, palm trees, sun, and surf is etched on the minds of nearly everyone. So it is shocking to learn that Hawaii stands as one of the world's most graphic examples of an environmental disaster. Today, Hawaii is a state of many superlatives, but some are alarming. Hawaii can rightly be called the bird extinction capital of the world. No place on Earth has experienced as many extinctions since human settlement.
Based on the fossil record, Hawaii used to have at least 113 bird species that we know of, and of those 113 species, 71 are now extinct. Of the remaining species, 33 are on the endangered species list.
Between 1964 and today, I have seen alive in the forest individuals of 7 species of birds, one of which is only in captivity and the rest of which are gone.
In the United States and its territories, over 1/3 of all birds listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act are found in Hawaii, more than any other state. Among these, 10 species have not been seen for years, some not for decades. The situation of many of the remaining birds is precarious, with populations often reduced to tiny areas of remnant habitat.
The miller bird lives on an island that currently has no predators of any significance to this species. If there were a shipwreck and rats became established on this island, the bird would probably disappear in less than 2 years. This happened to the lace-end finch on Midway. Roof rats were introduced in World War II, and the bird, which occurred in the thousands then, was extinct in a year and a half. We know, for example, that the palila occurred on almost all of the main Hawaiian islands. Now it's limited to a small, high-altitude Malani forest on Mauna Kea.
Populations that once extended around Mauna Kea are no longer able to provide much reproduction. There's a handful of birds on the southern slope, a handful of birds which we moved or released from captivity on the northern slope, and that's it. This is the last area of the historical range of the palila. So if we lose them on the western slope, that's it entirely.
How did this tragedy come about, and why does it continue even today? The reason is a prolonged cascade of harmful non-native animals and plants introduced to the islands by humans, combined with the tendency for the island species, including birds that have evolved over millions of years in isolation, to be extremely vulnerable to the impacts of more widespread and less specialized species from the continents. Hawaii was without humans until between 300 and 500 AD, when the first Polynesian voyagers arrived. After a long sea voyage, Hawaii must have presented an incredible opportunity with its rich abundance of flightless geese, ground-nesting birds, and seafood resources. Cave remains suggest that early settlers in Hawaii took advantage of this easy food supply and quickly drove many birds, such as the moanalu, a 4-foot-tall flightless goose that laid coconut-sized eggs, to extinction. Following this first wave of human colonization and bird extinctions was the arrival of Europeans in 1778. This set off a new wave of animal and plant introductions as the Europeans established Hawaii as a mid-ocean stopover and trading post. Rats became ubiquitous. Domestic cats, one of the world's most efficient predators, escaped into the wild. Domestic dogs were left to run free. In the ensuing years, as Hawaii's human population grew, more and more non-native species arrived, some intentionally, some accidentally, but nearly all with dire consequences. The problem continues today.
One single domestic dog or feral dog can destroy an entire colony. They go around killing all of the birds by breaking their necks. They don't consume them, they just kill them all. Even cats have been seen on the back of albatross trying to get them. Rats are a problem when the chicks are very little.
This is a skull that was part of a cat predation event. We think one of the birds got hung up in the fence line over here and was eaten by a cat. And cats generally take the smaller chicks and smaller seabirds. In Hawaii, it takes a lot of guts to work up the courage to attack an albatross because they're significantly bigger than a cat. But we do know that on other colonies, cats have learned that these guys just sit still and they're easy pickings.
It's not only introduced mammals that threaten Hawaii's native species. Nearly 100 exotic bird species have been imported to the islands, in part to replace the native Hawaiian species that went extinct, and in part to enliven settlements with exotic species.
Ahead of us over here are some cattle egrets. These are thought to have been brought in somewhere around the 1920s, but we've definitely seen direct evidence of egrets taking more hen chicks, and we try to control them the best we can. Other invasive species that we have a problem with on refuge are bullfrogs. When you look inside any of these ponds, you see many, many tadpoles of bullfrogs, and the bullfrogs get large enough where they can take the baby stilts, moorhens, coots. They can take any of these stilts the first few days of life. They're definitely vulnerable to bullfrogs, and we say they run the bullfrog gauntlet.
The toll on native birds by non-native animals and plants over the past 200 years has been extraordinary. Cows, goats, sheep, and pigs spread into the native forests where they have methodically consumed native plants, halted the natural recruitment of seedling trees, and degraded the native landscapes, often completely destroying native forests. Invasive non-native plants such as strawberry guava and California grass outcompete native species, often overwhelming whole forests and replacing them with single-species stands inhospitable to all but non-native birds. Non-native insects imported with non-native plants harm native insects and plants. The development of cities and towns and conversion of lands for agriculture has further destroyed native biodiversity. The most insidious threat comes from introduced disease. Just as Hawaiian birds evolved in the absence of predatory mammals, they also evolved in the absence of parasitic insects and the diseases they transmit.
Mosquitoes are not native to Hawaii. They were introduced back in the mid-1800s along with two specific diseases, avian pox and avian malaria, which are both mosquito-borne diseases. Pigs destroy native habitat, but they also create wallows that provide habitat for the mosquitoes to breed in. The native forest birds don't have any immunities to these diseases. They're not resistant to these diseases. So what happens is for instance, EEV, which is a common honey creeper, one bite from a malarial mosquito and they roll over dead in about 3 to 4 weeks.
Now only high elevation forests, generally too cold for mosquitoes, are safe zones for native birds.
Most of the native forest birds are not found below 4,500 feet. Hakalau Forest goes up to about 6,500 feet. So that zone between 4,500 and 6,500 is extremely important for protecting Hawaii's forest birds.
Only the Big Island and Maui now provide areas high enough to be truly mosquito and disease-free. As a result, nearly all native forest birds have disappeared from Molokai, Lanai, and Oahu, and Kauai's endemic species are in steep decline. Encouragingly, though, we are beginning to see signs of resistance to malaria emerging in some species. This could be a significant development, as global warming enables mosquitoes to survive at ever higher elevations and reduces the size of the mosquito-free zones. So why should we care if we lose some or all of Hawaii's native birds? So many have gone extinct already. Is it really worth trying to save those that remain? Can we really justify the cost? Hawaiian birds are the product of millions of years of evolution and are beautifully adapted to their native environment. Each species is a critical component of an exquisitely finely tuned ecosystem. At a purely biological level, saving the birds of Hawaii is critical to preserving the rest of the island's biodiversity.
These birds were primary drivers in the nutrient cycle on these islands. If you think about 10,000 times as many seabirds as we have today, coming to these islands every few days to feed their young, defecating on the island, what they're doing is they're bringing nutrients from the ocean in the form of fish and squid and depositing this on land in an immediately usable form. So that these native plants were probably highly dependent on these birds.
There's stories of our kupuna, of our elders, talking about the amount of seabirds coming down out of the mountains like a dark cloud. There had to be hundreds of thousands of birds up there. In the old days, it was not even 100 years ago. And when you take that huge of a chunk out of the nutrient cycle, of course our native ecosystems are going to have a hard time surviving because they've co-evolved to have that.
At an ethical level, we must acknowledge our responsibility for these American birds. The protection and conservation of Hawaiian birds is our task to assume for the very reason that we are directly at fault for their declines, and it is well within our power to redress this balance. At a legal level, the Endangered Species Act does not arbitrarily allow for the decision to let some species go extinct and for others to persist. It assumes that we will protect species based on their need and work to recover their populations. At a cultural level, we should care about Hawaiian birds because they are part of our lives and an essential part of what makes Hawaii, Hawaii. Native Hawaiians have an especially deep and meaningful connection with native birds.
If you lose that EEV that was celebrated in song and chant, then you lose yet one more tangible connection that makes Hawaiians what they are. When you're living in an urbanized area, it's really easy to have no connection at all with the living natural landscape. It's easy to not care at all about the plants or animals that are growing around you because it was somebody's job to put the plants in the landscape for your enjoyment. If we had the kind of relationship where we recognize at our core how important those natural systems are to our quality of life and our very survival, that you might garner from living in a finite island system, that's the kind of relationship that we need to rebuild.
It's only going to be better for the people, the community, the land, the forest, the birds. It's all one package, and we need to protect everything all at once.
It is clear that the wave of extinction that began with the arrival of Polynesians and Europeans will continue if our conservation efforts are insufficient. But saving Hawaii's remaining native birds from extinction is absolutely possible and within our grasp.
One thing that's clear in our experience with the conservation of Hawaiian birds so far is that if you provide sufficient habitat, work aggressively to reduce threats, and employ all of the tools available to us to increase bird populations, we can achieve significant benefits for these birds.
Eradication of invasive species is paramount in the race to save Hawaii's birds. On Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge at the remote northwestern end of the Hawaiian archipelago, rats introduced during World War II devastated populations of ground-nesting seabirds, especially the small bonin petrel. In 1997, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service eradicated rats from Midway, and the petrel population rebounded from 5,000 pairs to over 100,000 pairs today. The larger the island, the harder it becomes to totally eradicate alien plants and animals. But the construction of fences around remaining high-quality natural habitat gives us the opportunity to create islands within islands. This technique is being used on a massive scale to save the endangered palila as one of several projects underway with support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Hawaii Forest Bird Keystone Initiative. The State Division of Forestry and Wildlife, with the support of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, American Bird Conservancy, and others, is constructing a 59-mile fence to protect palila critical habitat from exotic sheep and goats.
Right now, the Forest Bird Keystone Initiative is focused on three main initiatives. One of them is to fence the critical habitat for the palila on Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii. And the main ingredients of that will be the fencing of the mountain to exclude feral ungulates from Mauna Kea so that Mamani forests can regenerate. We really believe that that's fundamental to the recovery of palila. In addition, we'll be committing funding to habitat restoration and predator control efforts to increase the nesting success of palila.
At Guyana Point, the westernmost tip of land on the island of Oahu, the first specialized predator-proof fence of its kind anywhere in the United States, was completed in March 2011. All mammals have been eradicated from the 59-acre exclosure, and nesting seabirds, including Laysan albatrosses, are already beginning to flourish in the absence of predators. The endangered Maui parrotbill is also a target for protective fencing projects.
One of the other Keystone Initiative projects will be the restoration of a new area for Maui parrotbills on leeward East Maui. And we believe with the removal of kikuyu grass, we'll see a lot of natural regeneration from the seed bank, which we believe still persists there, as well as we'll commit to extensive outplanting to speed that process along. And this will, of course, all be made possible by the fencing of this 2,500-acre area.
When species numbers get critically low, captive breeding programs become essential to their survival. The alala, or Hawaiian crow, is now down to just 95 individuals, all in captivity.
They're considered extinct in the wild, so there's been no confirmed sightings since 2002.
The captive breeding program has brought these biologists a rare luxury: time. Time until there is sufficient suitable habitat that can be properly managed to support a re-established population of alala in the wild.
We do species-intensive care for populations which are so close to extinction that everything, even throwing the kitchen sink at them, is a necessity in order to keep those populations alive.
For species restricted to one remaining place, translocation is a valuable technique. Here, individuals are captured and then transported from the original site to another suitable place. This creates an insurance population that can act as a buffer against the risks of extinction for species such as the miller bird. Until very recently, miller birds were restricted only to Nihoa, where their population fluctuates from approximately 300 to 800 birds and sometimes even fewer. Because of the potential risk of the introduction of mammals such as rats, which don't currently exist on the island, or a hurricane or other such event, it is important to have a second population to reduce the overall risk of extinction to the species. In September 2011, a small group of miller birds was translocated from their last remaining home on Nihoa to Laysan, where miller birds formerly occurred. While it is too early to know how these translocated birds will fare in their new home, it is encouraging that some have already attempted breeding there, and conservationists are hopeful that the project will create a safety net for the miller bird. The scale of the need in Hawaii is great. Conservation measures already underway or planned, while important, are insufficient to prevent additional bird extinctions. Despite the urgency of the situation, the plight of the archipelago's avifauna is underappreciated and underfunded.
The conservation of Hawaiian birds should be the United States' highest bird conservation priority, and I say should be because we're really not quite there. We really have not devoted the attention that's required to their conservation.
Hawaii has over 33% of the birds listed under the Endangered Species Act, but we get about 5% of the monies that go to all species across the United States. And there's a whole suite of reasons for this disparity. Probably the most important is that Hawaii is very remote. In other words, it's very far from Washington, so it doesn't get a lot of attention.
The problems that we have in Hawaii just don't have a high profile. People are unaware of how many threats there are, and people are unaware that we've already lost well over half our native species here, and that what we have remaining are all in really precarious shape.
In addition to their geographic isolation from the rest of the United States, many of Hawaii's remaining native birds are confined to high-elevation forests, where access is difficult or impossible for the casual tourist. The vast majority of Hawaiians are equally unaware of and feel unconnected to their native birds. There are widespread misconceptions about which birds are native and which are exotic.
So we have to find ways to increase awareness here in the state of Hawaii as well about what species are native, why they're worth protecting, what's their cultural significance, and what's their significance in the overall conservation picture for Hawaiian ecosystems.
Federal spending on endangered species is not always based on need. Frequently, economic and political conflict is the driver. Non-controversial species tend to receive less funding and less attention, whereas contentious species draw more press, more political discourse, and ultimately more lawsuits. The majority of such lawsuits involve mainland species, such as the spotted owl and the red-cockaded woodpecker. Not surprisingly, much of the support for the two Hawaiian forest birds that receive the most funding, the alala and palila, has resulted from legal action.
Hawaii is the most isolated of our states, and people here really feel it. They really feel that people on the mainland are not aware of the challenges that are faced here and not aware of the very, very hard work that's being done to overcome some of the threats to Hawaiian bird species.
We have the technology and we have the skills. It just takes a concentrated political and fiscal effort to actually eradicate these exotic animals and preserve the habitat.
In spite of the lack of funding, many state and federal agencies, conservation organizations, and committed individuals are making a difference. A clear pattern is emerging. Where land is managed effectively, such as in the Nature Conservancy's Waikamoi Preserve on Maui, Hawaiian birds are stable or increasing.
When we first started managing Waikamoi, 60% of the ground area was dug up by feral pigs. We fenced the area, we removed the feral animals, we established vegetation plots. We went back and resampled those same plots 14 years later. We found a 300% increase in the amount of shrub cover and certain types of vegetation in those plots. We can't seem to do enough fast enough for forest birds.
Conserving Hawaii's remaining avifauna has myriad challenges, many of which require novel solutions, careful, decisive planning, and swift implementation of expensive management actions. But it is absolutely doable. With the majority of important native bird habitat on public land, much of it under state management, there are great opportunities to overcome the tide of extinctions and to restore populations of native birds. It will require a significant paradigm shift, though, in which we place greater value on native species than on exotics. Currently, vast areas of state land are managed to preserve populations of exotic mouflon sheep, axis deer, feral pigs, and goats, solely to provide hunting opportunities for a small number of hunters. The amount of hunting land is out of proportion to the need and comes at the expense of the native bird species, which are forced to eke out their survival on ever smaller and more degraded lands. We need to strike a better balance between management of land for recreational hunting and protection and restoration of land for imperiled native birds and plants.
Hawaiian birds absolutely can be saved, but it's going to be expensive. We're talking about a little over $1 billion over a 10-year period to make significant inroads to the conservation of Hawaiian birds.
While expenditures of this scale are sobering, there are precedents for restoration efforts of this kind.
We didn't come easily to an Everglades restoration or a Great Lakes restoration, but we feel that this can be done and that it's essential that we reach out to senators and congressmen throughout this country and convince them that Hawaii, our 50th state, is the conservator of some of our country's most treasured natural ecosystems, and they're a treasure worth saving.
When I meet people who have lived on the islands for their whole life, who saw the Nukupu'u, who saw the Po'o'uli and the Maui Akepa, and to think that I'll never see those, and probably a lot of the young Hawaiian people on Maui will never see those birds again. I just would never want that to happen for the Maui parrotbill and the Akoikoi and the Maui Aloahio. We really owe it to future generations to work harder than we've ever worked before to save these forests and the birds.